guys, what is up? So today we've got a very exciting day. This is the start of a new patch, Rise of the Underworlds, and with it I've been deck building frantically for the past 4 days. I think I've spent at least a total of 20 hours just in the deck builder alone, and fine-tuning these lists, chaining card for cards, playing out scenarios. And today I've got something like 10 new decks. It actually might end up being more than that. I'm honestly not sure, for the new expansion. All right, guys, you know the drill. These are day one decks, which means as we see kind of how the meta starts to develop, I'll be making changes to these decks within the first 3 days, or maybe like a week after the expansion launches. So if you want updated versions, make sure to check out the site tier list, where I will be keeping updated versions of all of these lists. Also, I'm not going to mention the tier list anymore in this video, but I have gone through and updated the full tier list to a, speculatory, like, high tier decks that look good into the current card pool after the balance changes. So if you want to check out the tier list a day early before I make the video tomorrow, you can head over to swimstream.com and check it out. Without further ado, let's get into the deck. We're going to start right off the bat with the new archetype using the most new cards, Lurkers. For the most part, I think this is a fairly straightforward deck build, although you'll see a lot of different kinds of Lurkers for the first week. Lurker, of course, being the new mechanic, which is needing to have a Lurker on top of your deck to be able to attack and buff all of your Lurkers, right? Now, in this deck, I think the build that is going to make the most sense is going to be one that plays a little bit slower and more for predict. I've thought about this a lot. I've seen a lot of people run, like, the kind of like aggro packages, the kind of like Shapestone stuff, but Lurkers as an archetype is really going to be winning when you can get your champions to lurk. When your Rek'sai is on the top of your deck and that triggers, and when your Pike's on the top of your deck and that triggers, giving you the death from below. This is when, Lurkers are actually able to pay off and win in a major way, which is why I've gone for this build, using heavier predicts. Even Scrying Sands and Aspiring Chronomancer have felt really, really good in this list. So again, if you want to import any of these decks, the deck codes to the Mobalytics links will be in the pinned comment, or through the site. Next up, and oh yeah, we're doing these rapid fire, baby, Ekko Zilean. So this is a deck that's actually really, really interesting to build. I think there's a lot of different approaches to this. You definitely don't have to be in Zilean. As you can see, I'm only running one here. But basically, this is a predict heavy deck using the new champion Ekko. So Ekko is a champion that you have to level up by predicting 5 times, which at that point just gives you some really, really powerful win conditions. The chrono breaks basically just give you free resurrections and rallies that are like mini harrowings, which is just crazy. And so you want to build a deck that's just extremely heavy on predict. Now, to be able to win the game off of the chrono breaks resurrecting your board, you're gonna need some stats on the board, and that's why I think Xenotype Researchers is actually just one of the cores of this list. With this much predict, you are just going to be buffing all of your units. You're going to see so many of those buffed cards in your Feral Prescience, your Scrying Sands, etc. All of your, you guys have noticed I've jammed in most of the cheap predict cards here to be able to level up Ekko. We've got Time Trick as well. And even Drop Border coming out for free is actually really, really nice, especially when it gets buffed to a 4/6 off of Xenotype Researchers. So for the most part, this is just a nice kind of like beef deck that's going to have some flexible options based off of the predict, right? You're going to be able to choose the answers that you want, and every once in a while you're going to get a Hexite Crystal that might just be able to blow out the game entirely. Next up, we've got Pirate Burn. Now, a lot of the entries on this list aren't going to be decks using all new cards, but using older cards that got buffed or revamped. And Pirate Burn is back, baby. This deck has been pretty much out of the meta for a while. It was too slow for a Zero Aurelia. It's had one of the highest ladder win rates in, Runeterra's history at certain points in the past, but now with Make It Rain going back to 2 mana, this deck is definitely a lot more fearsome and a lot more flexible to adapt to specific metagames. Pirate Burn is a deck that is running a certain amount of Make It Rains. I mean, depending on the meta, you'll run anywhere between 0 and 3 in this deck, but the ability to run Make It Rain and to punish 1 health units is really, really powerful for Pirate Burn, and I actually expect Make It Rain to be pretty solid for the early days of the patch at least. I might start trimming this down a little bit later. But the fact that it allows you to take the deck, play it more slowly, play it more flexibly, and kind of lean more into the burn aspects than just like the full aggro is really, really nice, and is kind of what positions Pirate Burn so well into this metagame. Now, I can't say for sure exactly how competitive Lurk and Ekko are going to be. They're what's new, they're what's hot, and people will be like tweaking and refining the list as they go. I think they'll be closer to tier 2. Pirate Burn is almost certainly going to end up somewhere in tier 1, at least in early days. Ladder win rate will devastate the ladder. Another deck that will do very, very well on the ladder in the early days of this meta is Shen J4. Now, this is a kind of spicy new way to build Demacia Ionia. If you see some of the cards here, a pretty classic, just kind of like mid-range deck. We're just keeping units alive with barrier and using rallies to close out the game. But in this case, I've actually gone into Greenglade Lookout. Now that this card has been buffed to a 2/2, it's never really seen play before in decks. Like, it's always been a meme inclusion. It's never hit any competitive list as a 2/1. But now that it's buffed, it's a big deal. A deck like this can be able to use it to just, discount cards and get value out of things early. And we're going to be discounting our Bright Steel Formation or even our Sacred Protector, the new card that draws you a Shen when played and just, gives your allied barriers double attack. I'm not sure if Sacred Protector will stay in the list long term, but it's a new card, so I'm putting it in as a 1-of, and it's definitely worth trying out. You'll also notice that I'm on Twin Disciplines as a 3-of. Might come down to 2, but Twin Disciplines at 2 mana is completely crazy and makes decks like this quite a bit better. Right, and this is one that I'm actually personally very excited for. Check it out. This is Funsmith Dreadway with Ezreal and Gangplank. So if you've played some of the older school styles of PNZ Bilgewater, these haven't existed for a while except for like Fizz TF, but like Ezreal Bilgewater. Now that Make It Rain is back to 2 mana, baby, this deck can make a lot more sense, and it's got some sweet new tools that never really worked in this archetype before. Monster Harpoon for the first time might be making waves. This is a deck that has the ability to be pretty competitive depending on how the meta shakes out. Monster Harpoon hasn't been able to slot into a quite competitive deck yet, but now for the first time it's actually looking pretty good. We've got some of the sweet new tools like Time Trick, which Time Trick is amazing. You'll be running this in like pretty much every PNZ deck that's not just raw aggro. And of course, Time Winder is actually really not bad when we're getting free discard fodder off of Ballistic Bot every single turn. And of course, this deck is using Funsmith, the just straight up ridiculous amount of pings and everything this deck has going for it. We've got Make It Rain, Static Shock, Time Wander, you name it, even like using ignitions from Ballistic Bot from hand sometimes. Funsmith is going to ramp up a crazy amount of damage. She's seen as a meme card and she's been fringe, but she actually has seen a decent amount of like competitive player experimentation throughout ever since she got buffed to 4 mana. So this is a deck that actually has a ton of competitive potential. If you liked older styles of Ezreal or Ezreal Bilgewater, or you want a different way of playing Ezreal, this is the deck for you. Now this next one is Leblanc Sivir. I've always liked this deck. It's always felt kind of close. It has had some kind of like tier 3 win rates, but it's never really felt amazing, and always felt like there were better ways of playing LeBlanc as well as better ways of playing Sivir. But now I think we're actually at the point where this deck is very, very close. Might be able to make it because of this new card, Treasure Seeker. Now, I didn't think much of Treasure Seeker when I first saw it. Treasure Seeker just being the one that creates a Waking Sands in your hand. And of course, Waking Sands is the 2 mana summon a Sandstone Charger, right? Which is just a 5/2 ephemeral, basically, that it just gives you in your hand. So what does that mean? Well, in this deck, that's really powerful, not just because it helps you towards your reputation, but it's a really, really powerful combo with Vulnerable. If you're giving things vulnerable with Rockhopper and Merciless Hunter and Bakai Sandspinner, which this deck does a lot, then your 5-attack ephemeral unit can just challenge into something and trade, which is incredible. The more I look at Treasure Seeker, the more this is a really low-key card. You don't even need Vulnerable for Treasure Seeker to be amazing, and I expect it to see play in some other decks. For example, I think Treasure Seeker might actually work in Azir Aurelia. Not going to mention it in this video. If you want to see the version, check out the site. But there's a bit of the few spicy things you can do with Treasure Seeker in Shurima decks. But for the most part, this deck is just kind of like triggering reputation as much as possible, controlling the board, kind of putting pressure on and like massive threats until you drop Incisive Tactician. And the fact that it's 5 attack now is actually kind of nice. It doesn't really necessarily change a ton for how this deck plays out, but it's still a nice finisher, and being able to reliably get to reputation that fast with Thrashing Snapper and Treasure Seeker will help this deck out a ton. Next up, we've got Lee Sin. So Lee Sin is a kind of like so a blast from the past. Some of you guys might know Lee Sin, and some of you guys actually love playing Lee Sin, and you'll be rejoiced to hear Lee Sin is looking pretty good in the current meta. Now this is a perennially difficult deck to play, and because of that it'll probably won't have a tier 1 ladder win rate, but at super high ranks players will be playing it to the best of its capabilities, and I expect it to make big waves in stuff like, you know, the tournament meta, etc. Off of the back of a couple of changes. Twin Disciplines being at 2 mana is insane for this deck, and Will of Ionia going to 4 mana is really nice too. Now depending on how the meta goes, I might go down to 2 Will of Ionia, but for the most part, now that Hush is 3 mana and Will of Ionia is 4 mana, I've basically just cut Hush for Will. It's cost 1 more mana to literally not just, you know, reset the unit, but put it back in the hand too, which, you know, is pretty nice. But if you're interested in picking up this deck, it kind of plays as like a spell heavy combo deck where you're just trying to OTK with an Overwhelm Lee Sin off of your Zenith Blade, which is a very fun playstyle. In this case, I've actually put in 1 Tasty Fae Folk just as an additional buff target, and especially because I expect a decent amount of people to be running aggro decks on ladder. Alright, this next one comes in from my boy Kuvira, and it is a Howling Abyss deck. So basically the idea behind this deck is it's a new Shadow Isles Freljord Control version that, you know, now that Trundle Lissandra Control has been nerfed, and there's a lot of denies in this meta perhaps, so Feel the Rush might be a little bit awkward. Well, Howling Abyss is 6 mana, and suddenly this is actually a considerable finisher for a Shadow Isles Freljord Control style deck. It can just give you inevitability to close out the game, and I don't think there's going to be a ton of landmark removal because Ezreal Draven is coming down in value off of getting nerfed. Howling Abyss actually looks pretty well positioned here, and some of you guys might remember there was a tournament I played in. Oh god, this was a while ago. Only some of you guys will remember this, but I played in a tournament where I brought Howling Abyss in a very similar deck and ended up winning the tournament. I think Howling Abyss is a little bit better than people give it credit for. It's a very fringe meta call when you need a finisher and other finishers are kind of getting blocked for various reasons, like Feel the Rush just, you know, getting denied. But now that it's 6 mana and giving you level 2 champions every single turn, it's a great way to just start closeout games, and it's a lot of fun. So I'd recommend this deck for anyone who wants to play, you know, Shadow Isles Freljord Control, but now that Trundle Lissandra has been nerfed and Feel the Rush, Feel the Rush is alright, but a little bit vulnerable. This is a cool new way to try playing it to test out. We'll have to see how this ends up doing. All right, next up we've got Tliyah Thralls. Now this is a deck that I'm putting on this list because it's, I think, extremely well positioned into the new meta. Tliyah Thralls, for those of you guys who have been following the competitive meta for the last, you know, month, it's seeing a lot more play, and I think in a ladder environment, even the way the meta is shaping up off of these changes, I think Tliyah Thralls is actually extremely well positioned to be a kind of massive threat to the meta. I think it'll probably end up being tier 2. And there's some people that actually think it'll be tier 1. I think it'll have a hard time having like a tier 1 ladder win rate, but when played at a high level, I actually think this deck might end up being something like tier 1, which is absolutely crazy. You know, basically there's going to be less landmark removal, there's going to be, you know, more reasons to kind of like stabilize against the early game, less reasons to be in like Shadow Isles in a control deck than ever, and this is just kind of like one of the new iterations of Freljord Control that can just like blow out the game early in a way that's not really vulnerable to stuff like even Will of Ionia doesn't slow this deck down very much because you're often, you know, cloning your thralls before they're even coming out, so singular wills aren't gonna do that much. You've got freezes to deal with, you know, massive threats like Lee Sin. The deck is basically just very well rounded and looks good coming into this new meta, right? If your Lissandra levels up, you're gonna have free wins. The deck doesn't see many changes in terms of like new cards, but Clockhand is getting buffed, and the buff is actually significant. The fact that it has 7 attack now will actually matter in a decent amount of games that just go on for, you know, grind value. And I think Tliyah Thralls is actually really well positioned to, yeah, make some people pretty surprised. A lot of people underrated this deck. And finally, deck number 10. The deck that I'm maybe most excited for, just because if you guys watch me on Twitch, you guys know how much I play this deck. I play it a shit ton. This is Fisting Riven. Riven with Flurry of Fists and Draven. And basically, this deck is a combo deck that will just kill you, blow you up insanely fast with an Overwhelm unit, given Flurry of Fist, and just protecting it with stuff like survival skills, stuff like Notify Syncopation, and even in this case, Twin Disciplines being at 2 mana is gigantic for this deck. It's going to help our offensive combo as well as our protection tools at the same time, which is absurd. This single card in this deck makes it so much better, and I think that the top decks coming down a bit help this deck as well. Syncopation is going to be a really good answer to Will of Ionia in particular, which is something that's just, you know, a complete boogeyman on these kinds of all-in decks if you don't have good cheap counters to them. But I just had to put this on this list because personally this is literally my favorite deck in the game, and they're getting an amazing new tool off of Twin Disciplines. I mean, this is a deck that I've played more than anyone. I mean, hell, I've built this deck, and I think that this deck is actually very well positioned going into the meta as long as you're able to play it properly. I can guarantee you. So I'm gonna, you know, end this recording in a minute, and I'm gonna hop on my Twitch stream. If you want to check it out, it's twitch.tv/swimstream, and I will be probably playing this deck and seeing if I can climb with it. I want to see if I can climb to Masters with this deck this season, which we'll have to see. A lot of that comes down to how much of different kinds of decks we're going to be seeing on ladder. It's probably not going to be quite as competitive as like Lee Sin, for example, but still looking really, really spooky. And that's it, guys. These are 10 new decks, or a lot of like old decks with new cards in them for the new expansion. I wanted to focus on this video on, you know, a lot of the like older buffs, like buffs to older cards and things that we can do with some of those buffs. In terms of the newer cards, I mean, for the most part, Lurk is kind of just one deck. You can't use Pike outside of Lurkers, and you can't use, you know, Rek'sai outside of Lurkers as much as some people might want to pretend otherwise. And Ekko is kind of similar, a little bit more flexibility, but I think the true gem of this expansion, the new cards are sweet and they have their cool decks, but a lot of the new viability on ladder comes down to these buffs and nerfs. Like the just huge balance patch we had enables a lot of like older decks to come back with new forms, and I think that's really great. So these are my 10 new decks for the new expansion that I'd recommend. All of them will do pretty well for you on ladder. And hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow for the full kind of like meta tier list update. All right, see you guys then.